Okay. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at Abraham. And Abraham, in his prayers, he struggled to believe what God was going to do for him. He wanted a son, and if you condense down the 50-something years of his life that the Bible describes, it all revolved around that for the most part. There were some other issues, but he struggled to believe what God was going to do for him. And that struggle manifested itself in the prayers that he prayed that we looked at. After that, we went to Moses. Moses' struggle was to believe what God was going to do through him. And as we looked at that, in his dialogue with God at the burning bush, because we've accepted the fact that prayer is a dialogue with God, that what we saw was he really struggled to believe what God was going to do through him. From there, we went to Job. And we all know all about Job's trials, his struggles. Job's struggle was to believe what God was doing to him. Okay? Now, this week, we're going to go to the book of Habakkuk. So, I'm going to give you time, since none of you know where that book is, to look in your table of contents in your Bible and to locate Habakkuk. Habakkuk's struggle is different from these previous men. His struggle was to believe what God was going to do around him. Okay? And so, all of these men, their prayers had these different perspectives. Some were struggling to believe what God was going to do through them, and that's what we would call in the New Testament ministry. Ministry is what God does through us for other people. Ministry is not for ourselves, it's for others. Okay? Habakkuk, though, his point of contact with us is this. Ever since the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off, would we all not agree that that was kind of the first domino that started falling that produces all the controversy that we see in our society today? After that, we started to see the explosion of all of the gender orientation stuff, right? We saw wokeness, Black Lives Matter, defund the police. We saw all of that. Another thing that kind of is still playing out is the idea of where did the COVID-19 virus come from, right? Did it come from a lab in China? Birds on the wing? Where did it come from? What we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is this explosion of society that's in turmoil. A society that's in turmoil. And when we look at Habakkuk, what we're going to see is that his problems and his struggles with God, his prayers reflected that. Moses' prayers, his dialogue with God at the burning bush was all about me. I can't talk. I don't want to do this. Da-da-da-da-da. Abraham's, his prayers with God was it's all about me. I want a kid. Are you going to give me a son? I don't have a son. Right? Job's struggles with God, once again, it was all about me. What's God doing to me? Why is he doing that? Habakkuk is unique in all the prophets of the Old Testament. He's unique in this regard. All the other prophets, their scenario was they were sent to talk to people about God. Right? They had messages from God to the people. Habakkuk reversed that. He spent all of his time, we're going to see, talking to God about people. Okay? And that's kind of where some believers are today. They spend a lot of time talking to God about Joe Biden or whatever else that disturbs them. The school teachers that are liberal, the politicians that are corrupt, the church that is in decay and it's losing its power in society. Okay? And so Habakkuk is that kind of guy. His problem is not so much with his own life, his own circumstances. His problem is, God, what are you going to do about all this crap that's going on around me? So, if you found Habakkuk, I've given you enough time. So, what I want you to do is we're going to read starting in chapter 1. This is a message that the prophet Habakkuk received in a vision. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed. There's no justice in the court. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted. Does that not accurately describe the way some of us feel when we look around? All right? That was this man's dilemma. You don't see any hint in this discourse of his own circumstances, of his own life. His problem is all about what he sees. Okay? You need to understand something about Habakkuk's time, though, to fully appreciate his perspective. Most commentators think that his time span was from about 626 BC to 590 BC. What we know for sure, that long about 590 BC, that Nebuchadnezzar, who was about 600 miles away from Israel in Babylon, was coming over and making raids and conquering people in the vicinity of Israel. Most of you are probably familiar that in 586 was when Babylon came in, conquered Jerusalem, took these people away, and in fact the book of Daniel, some of you are probably familiar with that, he was one of the captives that got carried back to Babylon and served in Nebuchadnezzar's court. So you got to understand that from Habakkuk's point of view, he's seeing his nation become more and more vulnerable to outside attacks. Okay? But his primary problem, though, is the corruption that he sees within the community of faith, within the nation of Israel itself. Because by the time he comes on the scene in the late 1600s, or the early 1600s, since the clock is winding down, is that we know that Israel and Judah had a series of good and bad kings. Okay? Some were good, some were bad. The one right before Habakkuk was a king named Manasseh. And he has the shining commendation of Scripture of being the most evil king Israel or Judah ever had. He was the worst of the worst. After him, there was a king named Josiah. Okay? And Josiah ruled for about 38 years. Josiah, when you read the scriptural record for him, had the best commendation. The writers in Chronicles and Kings say that there was no king as good as him. So Josiah comes on the scene, and he institutes what we would call a revival. When you read Kings and Chronicles, you read for a couple of chapters in there, story after story after story, where Josiah is trying to bring back the covenant people of Israel to their God. I call it a top-down reform. He's the president, and he's going to mandate Christianity in the nation. And so he goes through all of this. What's happening, though, in the bigger political scene, even as we know in our day, the nation of China is rising in ascendancy. China was nothing to most of us 50 years ago or 40 years ago, was it? Now, it's in the headlines a lot. To make the comparison with Israel, Israel is declining, and what's going on around them, that you have Babylon in the east, which at this point, they're not really a strong power. They're just getting some traction. But you have Assyria to the north. And by the time Habakkuk comes on the scene, Assyria has already conquered the northern part of the tribe of Israel. Okay? And then you have Egypt over here to the far west, who's been a power for years. So you have these three big powers, and they're all fighting basically over the land that's around Israel and Israel. Okay? So Habakkuk sees his nation two different ways. We are vulnerable from the inside in that the community of faith is becoming more and more corrupt. We are vulnerable from the outside because all these nations are getting their military power. How does that refer to us? Would we not agree that in the last 40 years the church is not what it used to be? We have doctrinal heresies that are creeping in. When I was a child, the Methodist Church really was not a bad place. Now they are openly sanctioning gay ministers. Okay? And once again, like China was nothing 40 or 50 years ago to the U.S., now they're in center stage. So that's Habakkuk's problem. And so he sees all of this corruption going on in the nation. And so he lets God have it in prayer. Pick up with me in verse 5 and let's see what God said to him. Look around at the nations, look and be amazed, for I'm doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it. I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and they do whatever they like. Their horses are swifter than cheetahs and fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their charioteers charge from far away. Like eagles, they swoop down to devour their prey. On they come, all bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, sweeping captives ahead of them like sand. They scoff at kings and princes. They scorn at all their fortresses. They simply pile ramps of earth against their walls and capture them. They sweep past like the wind and are gone, but they are guilty, for their own strength is their God. What happened in Habakkuk's time was that Babylon came and conquered Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. Okay? So Habakkuk has seen that. Here's the thing. Habakkuk's worried about the evil in Israel. And what if you had to summarize this answer that God just gave him about that complaint, how would you summarize it? Pardon?
Don't worry, I've got this.
That? Okay, so he is sovereign. But don't you find it interesting that instead of patting Habakkuk on the back and saying, it's going to be okay, I'm going to save Israel, your nation's going to survive, I'm going to take care of these Babylonians, they're really bad, but just watch me hammer them. God does not say that at all. What does God say?
He's just describing how mean and evil and horrible these people are, and this is what's going to happen.
He describes, in fact, what he's calling Habakkuk attention to is, let me tell you about just how bad these people are. I want to make sure you understand how wicked this nation is. And the key phrase is that I am raising up. Habakkuk, this holy God, that for the last 1,500 years, your nation welfare has revolved around, the same God that led you out of Egypt, that slaughtered Pharaoh at the Red Sea, that took over in all the battles that Joshua went through. Remember that? Habakkuk, there's this history where God providentially helps y'all to conquer your foes. That's Habakkuk's background, right? But now this very same God is saying, Habakkuk, I'm raising up this polytheistic, godless nation that kills everybody. No promises about crossing the Jordan River and prevailing. No promises about David defeating Goliath. No, Habakkuk, I'm telling you life is not about to get better, it's about to get worse. What do y'all think about that?
It's scary.
Scary? Yes. I would be terrified. It would be like being a Jew in Nazi Germany. It would be like being a Jew in Nazi Germany, where you see your family members loaded up like cattle onto rail cars, and you're never going to see them again. Kind of tough, isn't it? Kind of tough. But the next pivotal phrase in this answer that God gives him is in verse 11. But they are deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God. God is letting Habakkuk know by this phrase is, Habakkuk, although I'm raising them up, they are already under my condemnation. I've already pronounced them guilty. And then he gives Habakkuk the reason why. Because they worship themselves. How many of you have heard of the philosophy of humanism? Describe humanism. What's humanism in a couple of sentences?
Man is the pinnacle of...
Man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things. And what God is saying is, these people who in our time we would describe as humanists, God's saying, I've already declared them guilty. There's a little bit of comfort here. Why? Because for whatever all the mysteries of God that we don't understand about him, we know that eventually he hands out justice to those who deserve it. However, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't, of course, I know nothing. I'm just saying, don't you think that if all this sin and violence and horrible things are going on, and the people are just, if people of faith aren't standing in the gap and trying to do what they're supposed to do, maybe, what do I know? Nothing. Maybe God is saying, okay, fine, this is what it's going to be. Sometimes I wonder like that about our country.
Right.
What are we doing
What
to
are we
hold
doing?
it back?
What do we do?
I had a student this past week, I was teaching about the Constitution and all of that, and she was saying, oh, this country's horrible and it's all going downhill. I said, well, about voting, I'm not going to vote. I said, well, why? Well, it's just going to be bad, blah, blah, blah. I said, fine. I said, you're just going to leave it to the other people then, whoever you think. I didn't take a position, I said, whoever they are. And she said, well, I said, what did I just teach you? Who is the government? 3 words. We the people. She goes, well, I got to think about it. I said, if we don't stand in the gap, who is?
Right.
Right. Regardless of what I'm
Nobody's telling them that now.
Pardon?
Nobody's telling them.
Well, I am, and I'm old.
That's enough, they keep teaching them.
I got the people from the GED people, that's what I'm doing, but I'm just saying, to me, sometimes, I don't know what's, I have no idea the mind of God, but I'm just saying, sometimes you wonder, saying, okay, I don't know.
How many of you remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? Most of you do. Were you shocked? I was a child, but I clearly could see it upset my parents. And some of you may have been around people who you would describe them as they became fearful. They became worried. It's like, what's going to happen now? To make the point of comparison with Habakkuk, he saw all those good reforms that Josiah did. However, in 609 BC, Josiah was killed in a battle with Assyria. And you can read about that in Kings and Chronicles. It talks about an archer's arrow found the chink in Josiah's armor, and he died within 24 hours. So once again, Habakkuk, like us, it's not that he does not have reason to be scared. He does. In his mind, he has reason to be scared because the president of the nation who was the greatest president we ever had, is now dead. And then I see all these developments on the horizon with these other nations. Okay? So once again, I'm just trying to, to appreciate Habakkuk's, what we're going to see in his life and what God told him. We have to feel the way he felt. We have to understand his nervousness. We have to understand the fact that he could not understand why this omnipotent, omniscient God, who had done all these great things in the past, did not drop the hammer down and do something. And I would think in the privacy of our hearts, I would say that there are some of us here that are frustrated why God does not do something. We know that he can, so why doesn't he? We know that he can, so why doesn't he? And that's Habakkuk's frustration. He is a man who's frustrated with the justice of God. While God does not clean things up. So, the first part of God's answer we need to realize is this. Habakkuk, I know even more about the evilness of these people than you do. You don't have to tell God how evil Joe Biden is. He already knows. You don't have to tell God what's going on in China, in secret labs, or wherever else things are going on. You don't have to tell him about the nuclear missiles that Iran is working on. He already knows. Okay? But the key thing before we go on is that God authorized all of it. What we saw in Job was that God authorized evil at the personal level. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
What we're seeing here is that God is authorizing evil at the national level. So let's look at Habakkuk's second complaint. Verse 12, O Lord my God, my Holy One, you who are eternal, surely you do not plan to wipe us out. O Lord our rock, you have sent these Babylonians to correct us, to punish us for our many sins. But you are pure and cannot stand the sight of evil. Will you wink at their treachery? Should you be silent when the wicked swallow up people more righteous than they? Are we only fish to be caught and killed? Are we only sea creatures that have no leader? Must we be strung up on their hooks, caught in their nets while they rejoice and celebrate? Then they will worship their nets and burn incense in front of them. These nets are the gods who have made us rich, they will claim. Will you let them get away with this forever? Will they succeed forever in their heartless conquest? I will climb up to my watchtower, stand at my guard post. There I will wait to see what the Lord says and how he will answer my complaint. So, Habakkuk's problem now is this, where he says that you have sent these Babylonians to correct us, to punish us, but you are pure and cannot stand the sight of evil. Should you be silent while the wicked swallow up people more righteous than they? Should you be silent while you allow the evil people of the United States to conquer your church?
That's not fair.
That is the problem. Habakkuk had the same problem at the national scale that Job had at the personal scale. We want a God that rewards righteousness and punishes wickedness the way we see it.
We want him to do all the work.
We want him to do all the work. But the most important thing is we want him to draw a line and say, well, as good as Jimmy is, I'm going to put him on the side of the righteous. But everybody who's worse than Jimmy, I'm going to put him on the side of the wicked. We want a God who draws that line where we are on the side of it we want to be on. That's the kind of God we want. The one that draws his line of judgment and automatically puts us on the right side because we try hard. And what God is saying is here is, Habakkuk, I'm going to draw the line. But here, there's a deeper conundrum here. God uses evil to punish evil. We want God to use righteousness to punish evil. We want Him to use the virtuous judge to drop the gavel on those who are evil. But in the mysteries of God and His providence, He uses the corrupt to punish the corrupt. He uses the evil to punish the evil. And that does not make sense to any of us, does it? Who of us, when we were raising our children, used evil to punish them? We never did. In fact, the whole thing that we wanted them to understand is that this is righteousness, you've been bad, and this is what's going to happen. Right? God sets that aside, and He says, no, I'm going to raise up these Nazis in Germany to do my will. However, Habakkuk, I understand they are guilty. I understand they are humanist. And even as God told Habakkuk that their strength was their God, Habakkuk realizes it in verse 14 and 15. He says, must we strung up on their hooks and caught in their nets while they rejoice and celebrate? Then they will worship their nets and burn incense in front of them. We don't do a lot of incense burning in our time, but we're all familiar with the idea of incense being burnt in worship in the Old Testament, right? So Habakkuk is saying, God, if you let these people this happen, they're not going to turn to you. In other words, let's put it a little bit sharper. God, if you let them prosper and you bless them, the logical response should be they would worship you. But they're going to look at your blessing and think they did it all by themselves. In our reasoning, we think if God would bless us, we would worship Him more. If He would just do one more miracle, we would trust Him more. God would say the history of the Old Testament is when I part Red Seas and speak with lightning on Mount Sinai and conquer nations in Canaan, it does not seem to result in faith. My people still drift away. So God says, well, since that method isn't working, I'll try the other side of the coin. I'll whip them down and maybe then they'll turn to me. Well, sometimes that works. But these people, it's not going to work. They're just going to burn incense to their net. God's going to bless them for a short period of time. They're going to rise to power. The Babylonians are going to rise to power. But their prospering is not going to result in them looking at Judah and saying, we've had it so good. Judah worships the God of the universe. Maybe we should too. Did you catch that? Those godless people are not going to connect the God of Israel with their rise to power and their blessing. Instead, they're going to become even more staunch atheists. They're just going to worship their nets that much more intensely. Yes?
Don't you think that's because they don't recognize the God that the Israelites have? I mean, they're going to continue to believe the gods that they worship are the gods that are blessing them. Whether it's themselves or the gods of the faith or whatever. So it seems to me that only the Israelites would be the ones to recognize the true God's hand, whether He's prospering them, whether it's in crisis like in Egypt where they have to cry out to Him. But the other nations that don't acknowledge Israel's God are still going to think that the gods they the God of the sun, the God of whatever, the nets. So it seems to me that they would think their gods are the ones prospering them. So it wouldn't seem like they would turn to Israel as God.
Typically, what people do, and this is what Babylonians do, people look at what immediately happened and they come to an immediate conclusion. In other words, whatever happened to me today, that must be the way God is. In other words, if I have a Job-like experience today, that must be the way God is. He just brings all this misery. If I won the lottery today, oh, that must be the way God is. Okay? And what you see with the Babylonians is that I call it a short-term point of view. In fact, you see it all the way, in all the battles you see described in Chronicles and Kings, okay, over those years, is that typically these nations that conquered them, they came to very short-term conclusions. Oh, we won the battle, so Israel's God must be impotent. Okay, I call it a very short-term way of thinking. Okay, and
Even the disciples, they walked with him and they saw everything he did.
right.
And then they didn't.
Yes, that's what I mean. What you see in human behavior is typically our attention spans are very short and our memories are very short. And in fact, just as a side note, what you see in the Old Testament is God is always trying to remind people of what happened in the past. In other words, He wants us to learn from history, not repeat it. Okay. Yeah.
I want to say something too. Today in our world, when I'm witnessing to a lot of people, they usually say, well, if there was a God, then why in the world is He letting people murder babies? And, why is this life so hard? And that's sometimes because we're so short-sighted.
Mm-hmm.
Even as Christians, sometimes we don't revel in the fact that God is in control. We don't see the other side because we don't understand why people get hurt when we use our babies and our husbands and all of this other thing. So then we condemn God rather than say, let me walk with me through this.
Right. Right. So, just to summarize to this point, Habakkuk has a problem with God, first of all, not dealing with the wicked people in the covenant community of faith. Then when God gives Habakkuk the bigger picture of the evil that's outside of the community of faith and how He's going to use that evil, then Habakkuk has a problem with that. So far, Habakkuk hasn't got any what I call really good answers to his problem. He's still struggling. And that's why he says, I will wait to see what the Lord says, how He will answer my complaint. So it's like Habakkuk puts his hand on his hips. God, I'm going to see what you have to say about that. Like Job, he's very confident that he's got it figured out. Like Job, he just needs God to kind of catch up with him and step up to the plate and give him the answers that he thinks he deserves. Even as Job thought he deserved some answers to his mysteries, Habakkuk at this point thinks he deserves some answers to his problems. Okay? So God gives him a second answer. Chapter 2, verse 2. Then the Lord said to me, write my answer plainly on tablets so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. This vision is for a future time. It describes the end and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not be delayed. Look at the proud. They trust in themselves and their lives are crooked, but the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. Wealth is treacherous, and the arrogant are never at rest. They open their mouths as wide as the grave, and like death they are never satisfied. In their greed they have gathered up many nations and swallowed many peoples. But soon their captives will taunt them. They will mock them, saying, What sorrow awaits you, thieves? Now you will get what you deserve. You became rich by extortion, but how much longer can this go on? Suddenly your debtors will take action. They will turn on you and take all you have, while you stand trembling and helpless, because you have plundered many nations. Now all the survivors will plunder you. You committed murder throughout the countryside and filled the towns with violence. Let's stop there. What's God saying to Habakkuk? First of all, in verse 2, he says, write my answer plainly on tablets so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. What is God saying there? When you write something on stone, that means it's not going to change. Right? The 10 Commandments were written how? Tablets of stone. That's why when God says something, he never has to go back and revise it and say, well, I forgot to think about this. Let's erase that and let's edit commandment number 7 because there was this little item I didn't take into consideration. When it comes to the future and God makes his predictions, God doesn't say, well, there's an 80% chance of rain today. No, when God talks about the weather, he only uses one word, 100% chance. There's a 100% chance a hurricane's going to happen. There's a 100% chance the sun's going to shine. Why? Because when you're omnipotent, you can make it happen. And so what God's trying to get across to Habakkuk is what? Habakkuk, let me refresh your memory on who I am. If you were to look at God's answer to Job, it revolved around who God is, not what God was doing. I will say that again because that's the ultimate answer to everything. It's not what is God doing, is it who is this God in the first place? I've said it before that a test of faith is not so much a test of your faith, that you muster up more faith. A test of faith is a test of what you truly believe the attributes of God to be. If you truly believe he is who he says he is, faith will follow. If you do not truly believe that he is who he claims to be, faith will not follow. If I go to anybody here and say, just give me $100,000 and invest it with me, you have a problem. You have to decide not what does Jimmy know about money. The first thing you have to decide is Jimmy trustworthy? The first question about God is not what is he going to do in my life with cancer. The first question I have to answer about God is, who is he? What do I truly believe him to be? Then I work my way out to the future, to economics, to health, to all of these things that we spend all of our time worrying about. But the first question we have to ask ourselves is, who is he? The problem is this. Most of you, like me, have been in church for 1,000,000 years, and if I were to give you a test on paper, you would make 100%. You would be on the dean's list with your theology. The problem is God has to use circumstances to move that theology from here, 1 foot down, to here. And if God does not do something, that theology stays up here forever. And that was Habakkuk's problem. Is the God that is telling me that he's raising up Nazi Germany and the Babylonians and the Chinese, is that the same God that fulfilled his promise to Abraham? Is that the exact same God that providentially helped us conquer all those polytheistic tribes in Canaan? Is that the same God that helped David defeat the Philistines? Is that the same God? That is the problem. Habakkuk had to decide, like all of us. How many of you in this room, with a show of hands, have seen God's faithfulness to you in some very big way in the past? I see most every hand raised. Next week, when the bottom drops out, you will have to decide, do I still believe that? You will have to decide, like Habakkuk, what have I learned from my history? Because God is confronting me with these evil Babylonians that are slaughtering babies. And God, not only that, is saying, not only am I aware of it, I'm raising them up. Habakkuk, not only am I sitting here with my arms folded in heaven on my throne, just watching this happen. No, Habakkuk, I'm actively involved in all of this. And even as that made Habakkuk choke, it will make us choke. But the answer to the question comes down to two things. What have I seen God do in my past at the personal level? Okay? And what does that matter now? He tells Habakkuk in verse 3, this vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will be fulfilled. And here's another key phrase. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. I became a Christian in the 70s. How many of you from the 70s can remember what gasoline prices were doing? You remember? What were they doing? How many of you waited in lines to get gas with lines of cars at a gas pump in the 70s? Okay? Here's the deal I've noticed over my life as a Christian. Every time the U.S. has a national crisis, Christian theologians get out there and start trying to tie in Revelation to it. There's a man, he's dead now. His name is John Walford. He was the head of Dallas Seminary for 35 years. Flagship seminary of conservative evangelicalism. His academic specialty as a professor was eschatology, end-time events. I spent my 35 years in the working world working for Exxon. This man spent his working world studying just about 5 books of the Bible. Daniel, Revelation, the prophetic books. So he writes a book in the 70s. And in the book, basically the thesis was this. Due to the rise in fuel prices, we know that now the Middle East is about to be the center stage of the world. Okay? The end times have come. We're fixing to see the Antichrist rise up. The price of oil is going to give this person power over there. And you can fill in the rest of the story. My question for you is this. Was he right? Was he right? No. How many of you remember a book called The Late Great Planet Earth? Hal Lindsey. You remember it? Okay. Hal Lindsey was another one. They all came out of the woodwork every time because we had oil prices that were going through the roof. I've noticed something since COVID-19. Those same types of books are becoming bestsellers. David Jeremiah has written one. Okay? Now you're going to say, well, Jimmy, who are you to tackle David Jeremiah? David Jeremiah, I'm not going to say is not right. Maybe he is. But I'm saying it's something in conservative Christianity in the United States of America that every time there's a national crisis, Christian theologians come out of the woodwork and they try to predict the future. And I find it amazing that we have some of the most powerful computers on earth nowadays with the National Weather Service trying to predict paths of hurricanes. And they still can't get it right, can they? What if you can't predict the weather from one day to the next? What makes you think you can know what a nation's going to do 5 years out? I don't care how much of Revelation you know. Think about that.
Well, in a way, you kind of look at things that are happening and you know the prophecies and things, so you could probably say, well, we might be close to the end. You better get ready.
The whole thing about Jesus when he talked about in Matthew 24, when he talked about rumors and wars and da-da-da-da-da-da, how many remember that phrase from Matthew? When you hear rumors and wars and rumors, do you know what Jesus said to them? He didn't say this. Get out the book of Daniel and start figuring it out.
No.
You know what he said?
Be prepared.
No. Don't be alarmed. Don't be alarmed. Jesus' own statement about how to deal with wars and rumors of wars and the end times comes down to one phrase. He said one thing. Don't be alarmed. We look for every other answer but that. We scour these books about the end times looking for something to help us feel better. That's a fallacy for two reasons. One is, even if you know it, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Because you're not going to be able to stop it. Why? Because God is authorizing those Babylonians, not you. God is authorizing the Babylonians, not you. So I don't care if you're David, Jeremiah, John Walford, or Billy Graham. God is authorizing these people, not you. So don't think because you figure it out, you can change it. Don't think that even if God gives you a crystal ball like he did Habakkuk, when you read all this, just because Habakkuk knew it, God didn't say, okay, Habakkuk, now that I've given you an inside glimpse, now you can talk to me and I'll change it. The point is this. It's what Jesus told the 12 men that he loved. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. Because Jesus tells them he had it all under control. God tells Habakkuk, this is going to happen and it's not going to be delayed. How am I doing? And so, that is really the point for all of us. We're going to finish up Habakkuk next week. Because how many of you are aware of the famous prayer at the end of Habakkuk? Good. Don't read it. That way you'll get louder. This. But basically, there's a good news in here to Habakkuk, and the same answer that God gave Habakkuk, he gives us. And it comes down to verse 4. But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. Or to summarize it the way Paul did in the book of Romans, when Paul is explaining salvation, the righteous will live by faith. What's he trying to get across to Habakkuk here? Habakkuk, the righteous does not live by their knowledge of the future. Habakkuk, you will not live by your knowledge of the future. Habakkuk, the righteous, always have been and always will live by faith. And Paul uses that verse to build the foundation of our salvation in Romans. He uses it again in Galatians. How many of you have heard of Martin Luther? Martin Luther was neck deep in Catholicism. And his conscience tormented him because he could not have peace that he had a good relationship with God. He had no peace. And by his own testimony, when he read this verse, it was like a light came on. And Martin Luther saw that salvation is by faith, not by the works and indulgences that the Catholic Church was dictating. And that was the verse that sparked the Reformation. That was the verse that gave rise to the greatest revival the church has ever seen in the last 2,200 years. And ultimately that idea was the same idea that God was trying to get across to Job. Job, you will not live by answers. You will not live by your rational logic. And your friends definitely are wrong. Remember Job's friends? Good people get good things, bad people get bad things. Job had to come to terms with the idea that the righteous will live by faith, not by explanations. Habakkuk is going to have to come to terms with the idea that God has to be dealt with on the basis of faith, no matter how much you know about the future. So when I look at my future at the personal level, whether it's my own financial security, my own health security, or whatever it is, or if I look at my future as an American citizen with what's going on in our society, I have to come to terms with this idea, Jimmy. There's two things. God is at work. You're probably not going to understand it. And like Habakkuk, it won't make sense to you that the righteous might be swallowed up by people more wicked than they are. The righteous just might be swallowed up by people more wicked than they are. But, Jimmy, God also says what he told Habakkuk. I know that they are guilty. So, we're going to stop right there. And I'm going to leave you with all this bad news. Okay? I know I'm leaving you with all this bad news. But hey, the book gets better toward the end. Okay? Okay?
Actually, it's good news because don't worry. I mean, that's the key. Don't worry. That's it.
Yes. You don't, like Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 24, don't be alarmed just because you hear wars and rumors of wars.
Right.
Yes?
The recount of it all is live like tomorrow isn't. I mean, then you don't have to worry.
Right.
Because you're ready.
Right. Right. Just as a